Hello and welcome to this edition of A Page from History. I am Nilanjan Mukhopadhyay. In this program, every week we pick up landmark anniversaries of very significant events in history and go into the depths of the questions involved. We discuss various issues, national and international, covering a wide range of topics: politics, business, diplomacy, and culture. In today's episode of A Page from History, I will go fairly deep into history to the time when the Indian national movement took a major step forward. Beginning as a reaction to the British decision to partition Bengal, the Swadeshi Movement was formally proclaimed at a public meeting in the Town Hall of Calcutta exactly 105 years ago. Within weeks, the movement spread and drew new social groups, women, students, and people from rural Bengal who had never joined protests till then. Soon the movement spread to other parts of the country, and over the next few years, the Swadeshi movement spawned the emergence of almost all major political trends of the Indian national movement. The importance of the Swadeshi movement lies in the fact that it was not confined to politics alone, and that too in one region. This period actually saw a burst of creativity in the entire country. Major developments took place in these years in Indian art, literature, music, science, and even industry. It was a kind of an indigenous renaissance, if one can call it so, all inspired by the Swadeshi movement. To discuss the importance of this phase of history and understand its relevance today, I am joined by three very eminent historians. My first guest is Dr. Vishalakshi Menon, who teaches history at the Jesus and Mary College in Delhi University. Rohit Wanchoo from St. Stephen's College, also a historian. Dr. Suecheta Mahajan from the Jawaharlal Nehru University. Vishalakshi, I'll begin with you. Let's look at the beginning of the Swadeshi movement and the backdrop, the Bengal partition. First of all, we must try to understand that why did the British think of partitioning Bengal? Why was it so important for the continuation of the colonial order?
Well, to start with, there was no denying the fact that Bengal was an unwieldy province, because we must remember that it consisted of the three areas of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa at that point of time, and it was by far the largest of the presidencies, and therefore it did require some kind of pruning. But the point was, on what basis should separation take place? It would have made eminent sense to have had a partition of the Bengal presidency into two units, one of which would have been the Bengali-speaking areas, and the other would have been to separate Bihar and Orissa, which did happen in a sense later. But why was that not done? And instead, it was decided that one part of Bengal, that is the western part of Bengal, would be attached to Bihar and Orissa, right, and would form one unit, and you would have East Bengal forming the other unit. So this was really the crux of the whole issue and what enraged the Bengalis most. And if we go into the reasons why Lord Curzon actually decided to go in for this kind of a partition of Bengal, then we find that the reasons were very simple. That there was several reasons. For one, the idea was to isolate or rather separate Calcutta, which was a hotbed of political activity by that time, from what was considered to be the more docile and the less politically turbulent parts of eastern Bengal. The second was part of the whole overall policy of divide and rule of the British government, where the Muslim majority areas of East Bengal were sought to be given their own province with a new capital, which would be Dhaka, and it would act as an incentive for this particular group, for the Muslims, and the comparatively the Hindu majority West Bengal areas would then constitute a separate province. Then, there was, if you look at Curzon's overall policies, then you find that it seems to have been his entire mandate or his effort was to somehow the other control the growing political, and there's no denying the fact that in the late 1890s and the first 5 years of the 20th century, in Bengal and in several other parts of the country, especially in Maharashtra, there was a tremendous amount of political ferment, and this was growing to alarming proportions. So the British were looking for all kinds of ways to control it, and the partition of Bengal has to be seen alongside with all the other policies that Curzon adopted, the Universities Act and various other attempts that were made to control the political, growing political ferment in the country.
Rohit Wanchoo, I want you to address one question, that it was finally in 1905, in July 1905 to be precise, that the British finally decided to officially partition Bengal. But the entire, there had been a very more than a year-long debate within the British administration. What do you think was the nature of this debate, and why do you think that they took such a long time to actually finally make up their mind after having decided to partition Bengal?
I would think that there have been various historians who've argued that, as Vishalakshi Menon has just mentioned, that there were various proposals to divide the province of Bengal, because it was a very unwieldy province.
For administrative convenience.
And so there were various competing identities that were involved, that of the Assamese, who, as we know from subsequent history, were resentful of the Bengali migrations into Assam much later, but even earlier there was some marginal movement did exist, and there was also the problem of the Hindi-speaking parts of Bengal Presidency, which meant that there were possibilities of dividing Bengal in various ways, and at various times different proposals had come up. So Curzon actually, came after a long period of discussion, starting with the 1870s and so on. And so it can be argued that there were various policy options that were there. It would have made much more sense, as she just mentioned, on linguistic grounds, not to divide the Bengali-speaking people and to create a separate province on linguistic grounds. But the reason why they wanted to do it, and that's of course probably overstated in some respects, but it's a policy of trying to weaken Hindu-Muslim unity, particularly among the Bengali-speaking people, and because they were the most active in the early years of the 20th century. As it used to be said in those days that what Bengal does today, the rest of India does tomorrow, which is an indication that it was advanced political opinion that Curzon was most hostile to. He had the celebrated argument with Ramesh Chandra Dutt on the economic impact of British rule in India. He was extremely resentful of the way in which clever but effeminate Bengalis were taking over the administration. And so there are cultural stereotypes which are also involved in this particular process. So resentment at the quick-witted Bengali who would take over the administration, combined with a desire to expose his inadequacies, because one of the major charges that the Bhadralok would make against the British was that they represented in India the worst elements of British society, that what they admired was the achievements of British civilization, not its local representatives. So, there was this certain kind of air of superiority, as well as the seditious nature of the Bengali Bhadralok, which was an important thing that Curzon wanted to stamp out. That's why he chose this particular kind of division rather than anything else.
Suecheta Mahajan, I want to understand, why was there such a massive opposition to the partition in Bengal? Also linked to this is that, were the British unprepared for the kind of opposition which came up?
I think that's a very important question to try and assess, why at this particular point of time an administrative reordering of the province, which is what they presented it as, drew so much flack. After all, in 1874, as Dr. Wanchoo had pointed out, there had been an administrative reordering. Assam had been separated.
Yes.
We don't find this kind of opposition at that time. And so one of the reasons I think will very clearly be linked to the stage at which the national movement had reached at this point. And possibly this was one of those moments where one was kind of waiting for a qualitative jump, as it were. You know, there are always moments when you move to the next phase and something is required to trigger that off. And the partition of Bengal in itself, I don't, it acted as some kind of a trigger very clearly, because, I mean, if you look at it, it's not an accident that at this time, within a few years, you have the split at Surat. You know, the moderates and the extremists, you know, fall apart and decide to go in their different ways. You have the emergence of the whole trend of revolutionary terrorism as a separate kind of trend by the end of this decade. So it is a very, it is a revolutionary decade, if one can use such a phrase, both nationally and internationally. This is in 1905.
In fact, possibly this is the time, you know, when Indian nationalism first of all steps outside meeting halls to the streets.
Absolutely. The anniversary of what we are celebrating today, that huge gathering and demonstration in Calcutta, you know, this was something which was quite unprecedented. And at the same time as we're dealing with we're looking at the partition of Bengal, this is also the time when the Japanese have defeated the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War. So it's a combination of national, regional and international dimensions which can possibly explain the intensity of that opposition. Now, even at home, for example, this has been a decade when there's been a lot of rise in prices. You know, I mean, I can't give the sort of figures right now, but there's been unrest in the working class, which is again coming to a head, and one of the major features which we'll possibly talk about later.
You know, it's a very, very formative years, you know, in terms of the future development of Indian nationalism. It is time for us to take a small break. We'll just pause for a while and then come back and continue the discussion. A page from history will continue, and when we come back from the break, we will go a bit deeper into the Swadeshi movement and talk about how it began to make its presence felt outside Bengal. Be with us. Welcome back. Ask anyone to name a few important chapters in the Indian freedom struggle, and they'll surely say that the boycott and the burning of foreign goods during the turn of the 20th century was a key one. We are talking about the Swadeshi movement, 105 years after it sparked the public phase of India's struggle against colonial rule. Rohit Wanchoo, often it is said that the Swadeshi movement sparked off not just a new phase of the Indian national movement, but also acted as a catalyst for, you know, all-round creativity. You know, this is the time, you know, when India, a new India emerges. There is new initiatives in the field of art, in the field of literature, in the field of music, science, industry, all-round growth. Do you think it's directly linked to the Swadeshi movement?
Well, as has just been mentioned, this is the time when you have a general sense of awakening among the more advanced section of the Asian intelligentsia, which is, you know, really spurred on by the experience of an Asian power defeating a European power in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. So there is a sense of a emerging Asian sort of identity and presence, which is a major factor in spurring people in different parts of Asia. Also that various trends which had been in existence earlier actually coalesce on this question of a major agitation against the British policy of divide and rule, because it was perceived as such, could be seen. And now, historians may have different views about how much the British divided Indians, but Indians were convinced that the British
were trying to do
that the British were trying to do it.
Exactly.
So that acted as a major spur to all kinds of activity. And it was not confined simply to political themes. There was this sense of the disastrous impact of colonial rule on Indian society, which is why there was this great concern for Swadeshi industries. And various efforts were made to set up new industries, particularly the chemical industries. There were attempts to set up banks and financial enterprises. And it was also the period in which people, believed that it was important to have a system of education which was indigenous, that there was really no point in repeating what the British were saying. So the idea of national schools and education, the idea of indigenous enterprise, the idea of boycott of foreign goods. And this also, there were some who believed in Swadeshi and not boycott.
Right.
And some moderates thought that while it is important to emphasize Swadeshi, it is not necessary that you should have boycott. But Swadeshi was a common unifying element. And there was also the need to develop things along indigenous lines.
Right.
Now, this in its more extreme forms can take a sort of a more narrow-minded nationalist view, but at this stage it was more an element of self-discovery and of assertion against an overpowering British presence, rather than the assertion of a dominant, a narrow-minded perspective. So it is a broad-minded view.
Yeah. Vishalakshi, when the movement, starts going outside Bengal, now, do you think it is only Swadeshi which is going outside Bengal? After all, a viewpoint could be that the movement basically began against the partition of Bengal. Now, the partition of Bengal possibly was not such a major issue in other parts of India. So what was the nature of the movement, and how did the transition take place? Already by that time the concept of Swaraj had come into the movement. How do you see it playing out in other parts of the country?
Well, I mean, as the textbooks usually tell you, it's Lajpat Rai took it along to Punjab, Tilak took it to Maharashtra, it was taken to Madras presidency. Certainly, it's not seen. I mean, this is part of the growing sort of sense of a national, that you're Indians together, that what is affecting one part of the country is, something that people in other parts of the country also react to, and they see it as their cause as well.
But the demand was no longer just only the issue of partition.
Yes, it was just not quite
beyond that.
It goes much beyond that. And the various forms of, like for instance, you have the Ganpati festival, which was actually being celebrated by Tilak in Maharashtra from the 1890s onwards.
Right.
As part of the Swadeshi movement, now it becomes a festival which is celebrated in, or the Shivaji festival even, in
fact,
Calcutta.
This is an issue, on which there are various diverse opinions even among historians, whether the use of the religious symbols.
That's right. We can get into that a little later. Yeah. But so you notice that it's working both ways. Some of those kinds of symbols are being adopted from the other provinces and also coming into, the movement in Bengal. So it does spread out as being an all India movement, and that is where some of the differences actually come within the Congress also about whether this movement should spread to other parts of the country, whether it should become an all India kind of movement, and what other forms that the movement should take. For instance, I'll just mention this one thing, that you have the samitis, or the volunteer organizations, which are a very important part of it. And you have Ashwini Kumar Dutt in Borishal, who has actually been setting up these kinds of organizations even earlier, prior to the Swadeshi movement. But now it becomes a very important kind of organization of almost a parallel government, where there are in this area, in Borishal.
This entire business of even setting up an, a parallel system of, providing justice and, resolving disputes between the people.
Absolutely. And Hindu-Muslim unity also, which is what is worrying the British government also, the kind of popularity that he is actually able to get from amongst the Muslim peasantry of that area. So it's, I mean, I just see it as something which is now taken up by Indians in all parts of the country as being their cause. You know, what can happen in Bengal today can happen elsewhere tomorrow. The same feeling that Dr. Rohit Wanchoo was talking about. So you can't keep yourself isolated from it in that sense.
Suecheta, sometime back you were talking about the Surat, the split in 1907 in Surat. Now, this is also, you know, before we go into that, you know, let's try to understand that the reasons as to why extremism, you know, or the revolutionary terrorism, various ways to actually define the same political process. Why does it emerge? Why is a certain element of militancy creeping into Indian national movement at that time, and what is its impact?
Actually, I should not have used the word moderate extremists, because better to use the word militant nationalist for the extremists, as you rightly said.
There's
an element of militancy which is coming in. And you see very clearly the early nationalists who have been putting forward their agenda from 1885 onwards. There is, it's been 2 decades now, we're talking about 1905, and there is a strong sense of dissatisfaction with the methods that they've adopted.
That it's not yielding sufficient results.
It's not yielding sufficient results. I don't want to get into the question of whether it was mendicant politics or not. I don't think it was. It's a different thing. But very clearly there is a movement which is also linked with the social participation of the national movement at this time, that it's clearly shifting from a certain elite domination which we find in the early years of the Congress. It's moving to the youth in a very broad sense now, and therefore this is the politics of the youth. These are people who are coming into these.
Also, the women in Bengal, especially, were great, very active participants in the entire Swadeshi movement.
Yeah. So while we don't normally call it a mass movement of the Gandhian type, it hasn't reached that.
But the social base is definitely expanding.
Yet, but the social base has clearly expanded. And though very often we say that it's, you know, mainly limited to the Bhadralok, etc., there is a certain middle classness about the social base which was not there earlier. So the militant politics is also linked partly to this expanding base and the need for a kind of politics which can encompass a wide variety of aspirations within its agenda. You know, it can speak for a large variety of social groups which it represents now. And I think that the shift towards militant nationalism is largely indicative of this widening of the social base of the movement. Of course, once we, I mean, it shouldn't sound like a truism that of course the specific causes were there, as we know. There were repressive policies at this time which were coming in, you know, Curzon's policies, not just partition of Bengal, but, you know, other policies of trying to contain political protests. There was a certain profile of the colonial regime which provoked militancy. So that is another very clear factor. And the international situation, not only the Russo-Japanese War, but I think if we look at, this is also the time when you have the you have the revolution in Russia, the 1905 revolution.
So there is a certain amount of a working class consciousness which is beginning to spread.
Developing. As I mentioned earlier, there are signs of labor unrest, and also I think there's a certain self-confidence, which is what Rohit was talking about when he talked about the cultural ramifications of Swadeshi. There is a certain self-confidence of the intelligentsia and of the Indian people which was emerging at this time, which allowed this cultural expression. That is, you can express yourself in your own terms. You don't have to do it only in terms of the
at
British
this point,
idioms.
when you say, that allowing people, to express on their own terms, I want Rohit to respond to one particular issue, which just came up some time back. This entire issue of using religious symbols. There are various ways of looking at it. One is saying that it was possibly the main reason as to which eventually led to the Hindu-Muslim divide in India. The other way of looking at it is that a religious symbol should not be looked as religion per se, but should be looked at as a part of a larger cultural body, as the culture of the land. How do you respond to this?
Well, I can respond by, putting forth two major historiographical positions on this. One is the kind of argument which has been made that religion is a double-edged weapon, that it helps in mass mobilization. On the other hand, it tends to reinforce the ideology of religion, which can have negative effects in the long term. And so it's a risky thing, but it has certain short-term benefits. The other, which has become popular only very recently, is the communitarian perspective, which says that there is nothing wrong in religion per se, and that some of the problems that emerge in Indian politics are because of the denial of cultural and religious difference rather than an assertion or acceptance of religious difference. And so they tend to argue that the problem is not so much that you use religion, but that there are no attempts at resolving the problems by power sharing.
Exactly.
So that's the view.
Yeah. I'm so sorry to interrupt you at this stage. We'll take another short break and then come back and continue this discussion. When we come back from the break, we shall further expand the horizon of our discussion and also look at the impact of the Swadeshi movement on popular culture. Do not go away. Welcome back to A Page from History. In July 1905, the British announced the decision to partition Bengal after mulling over the proposal for more than a year. Indian moderate leaders realized that such methods would no longer work, and the Swadeshi movement began with the boycott of Manchester cloth and Liverpool salt. But more than anything, it sparked a new way of looking at India and Indianness for a large number of creative Indians. Vishalakshi, before going in for the discussion, we were talking about the use of religious symbols. Related to this is also, it's talking about, religion being part of a larger culture. We have been discussing about the cultural, renaissance which also came about, Two very important works of literature stand out, both Rabindranath Tagore's Ghare Baire, which has also been made into a classic film by Satyajit Ray, and his other equally important novel, Gora. Going into this entire issue of religious conflict, religious identity, the space of, the various characters in society, how do they interplay with what is happening in the world around them. This entire issue of religious identity, use of religious symbol, and its, reflection in literature. How do you look at this entire phenomenon?
You have mentioned Tagore's works, and I think it's very, very important because Tagore does take a very strong position. I mean, this is, when we talk of the Swadeshi movement, the names that really come to mind are Rabindranath Tagore, Sri Aurobindo, and some of the others, but people like Ashwini Kumar Dutt, etc. But we can see in Ghare Baire, that you have also referred to, how on this particular issue of religion and what some historians have described as this trend of religious revivalism, which was there in the last quarter of the 19th century, and which also plays itself out in the course of the Swadeshi movement. Tagore is extremely uncomfortable about it. Exactly. And there is this passage in Ghare Baire where he's actually, it's through, a lot of his ideas are conveyed through the character of Nikhil,
exactly,
who is the husband of Bimala, and there's Sandeep, who is the more hot-headed kind of person. So Nikhil at one point of time talks about how I'm okay with the whole movement, but I don't like this slogan of Vande Mataram.
Right.
Why should one worship the country? Why? How does the country become a god that you worship? And you can see how it is a direct kind of critique of Sri Aurobindo and the kind of, because he's bringing out a journal which is called the Vande Mataram at this point of time. And of course it becomes, the song itself is, one of the most important sort of rallying cries in this whole movement. So Ghare Baire actually becomes like a commentary on the Swadeshi movement. One of the ideas which is put forward very clearly is this, about, he's uncomfortable about the use of religion in it and what it could possibly do as far as the Muslims are concerned, the kind of alienation that it can cause, etc. The second is about the burning of foreign cloth, which we already find happening in the Swadeshi movement. And later, Tagore was to have very strong differences. I think they were, there's a kind of exchange with Gandhi on this issue. Why do you burn cloth? When in a country where a large number of people don't have cloth to wear, why should you burn cloth? You give it to the poor, you give it, you don't wear it.